Ja bih pre svega da pitam dva gospodina na način pripremanja propovedi, možda u kratkim crtama. Da li to izgleda uvek isto za tebe, Bero? Da li izgleda drugačije i kako to?
Misliš sada ili da li se menjalo vremenom?
Pa šta ti hoćeš da kažeš nama?
Mislim ovako, prva stvar, sada izgleda drugačije nego što je izgledao pre. Hoćeš ti prevoditi na drugi?
So yeah, I asked him about So I asked Bera, Pastor Bera, about the way he does sermon prep, and he said that it's been changing over the years.
Tako da, kako sad radim, razlikuje se u odnosu na ono kako sam nekada radio.
So the way I do sermon prep right now, it's different from how I used to do it.
Da. Sad se mnogo više zasniva na tome da čitam tekst i molim se nego na neke istraživanje dodatnih tekstova, dodatnih informacija.
So what I do right now is I read the text and I pray a lot more than I do like the research of like outer biblical texts and such things.
Da, tako da to je neka rutina kada otprilike znam šta je to što treba da dam crkvi, onda to sastavim i ograničim sebe na određeno vreme.
So what I do usually when that's my routine, and when I feel like I got something that I need to give to the church, that's kind of how I know it's done, and then I limit myself with
vreme koje ću tu uložiti u spremanje propovedi.
With the amount of time that I'll invest in that sermon prep.
Jer ono što sam nekad radio jeste da sam ulagao i po 30 sati u jednu propoved.
So I used to even prepare for a sermon for 30 hours.
I shvatio sam da tim ogromnim satima ništa ja zapravo nisam doprineo kvalitetu toga.
And something that I realize is that the amount of hours doesn't mean your sermon's going to be better quality.
Nego sam samo doprineo mom perfekcionizmu i ponosu.
But it only brought points to my perfectionism and my pride.
Tako da u načelu ograničim se na nekih 8 do 9 sati.
So what I usually do now is 8 to 9 hours of sermon prep.
To je trenutna rutina.
So that's my routine. So
I samo to kad vidim nešto što ne razumem, što mi pokreće neka pitanja, onda krećem samo za to da istražujem, znači konkretno za tu.
So when I usually see some questions coming out the text for me, that's kind of my starting point to go towards answering those questions.
Da.
Yep. Okay, so same question for you, brother. How does your sermon prep look like?
First of all, this is really difficult. I was asked just a few minutes ago, and like, here I am, sitting up here talking about this.
Nismo baš nešto posebno organizovani danas, tako da on je rekao kao, wow, malo pre ste me zamolili, tako da sam ono...
But this is good for me.
Ali ovo je dobro za mene.
First of all, what I don't do is put a lot of pressure on myself to like change the world or like expect people to walk out of church saying, man, that was one of the best sermons I ever heard.
Prva stvar jeste da kod pripremanja propovedi ne pokušavam da promenim svet i ne pokušavam da nateram ljude da kada izađu iz moje crkve kažu, wow, ovo je bila najbolja propoved ikada.
So if one person is impacted by that sermon and it makes some kind of change for them, I think that's a good sermon. The reason I think that is how many sermons have we heard in our lives?
Za mene jedna osoba da je promenjena mojom propovedi je super, jer realno koliko mnogo propovedi smo svi ovde čuli u našem životu.
That have changed our life.
A koji su nam promenili živote.
Maybe you can remember a handful of sermons from a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Možda može da ti padne na pamet samo nekoliko nekih propovedi od pre nekoliko godina.
So I know mostly sermons are just kind of satisfying for the soul momentarily, and they aren't going to make a life-changing impact.
I znam da većina propovedi nekako samo zadovolje taj trenutak za dušu, ali možda neće imati neki efekat u godinama pred nama.
So I try not to put too much pressure on myself.
Tako da ne pokušavam da stavim previše pritisak na sebe u vezi toga.
That being said, I dig into the text.
Tako da počinjem sa tim što ulazim duboko u tekst.
And I just try to do good Bible study first.
I ono što uradim jeste prvo dobro detaljno proučavanje teksta.
And then seek to find that core message that I think just holds that text together.
I pokušavam da nađem tu onako osnovni kao tekst, osnovno značenje
And then I just keep praying God to just keep showing me how to develop that message with the points I find there and just bring to mind the things that He wants me to speak about.
I molim se Bogu da mi pomogne sa drugim značenjima i ako nešto treba da kažem, da mi govori to da bih mogao prenijeti ljudima.
And I do what was said today, I like, how does this lead to Christ? And so I always think about how Christ needs to be in that message. And I don't always do a good job, but I do think about it.
I nešto što je rečeno danas jeste kako ovaj odlomak ukazuje na Isusa i ne mogu da kažem da svaki put to radim, ali to je jedno od pitanja koje ja pitam kada proučavam sa propoved.
And I don't have a lot of resources in my hands living here. I have to just find things on the different websites, the different resources online.
Kao što znamo, ovde na srpskom jeziku nema mnogo resursa za takve stvari. Ono što ja radim jeste idem online i tražim resurse na engleskom. Ja. So, imamo...
I na engleskom da te prevodim.
Ajde, može. Nešto što ja radim u pripremanju za propoved.
Brate.
Oh man, come on. Okay, so first of all, my situation is kind of specific in our church.
Moja specifična situacija u mojoj crkvi.
Because I rotate with 4 other preachers in our church.
Četvoro nas se rotiramo.
So I have 28 days to prepare a sermon.
Tako da imam 28 dana spremim.
Yeah, 4 weeks, and I know the text in advance.
4 nedelje i znam tekst unapred.
So I was talking to Mike, it's something that I like to read 4 weeks ahead.
Tako da
4
nedelje imam vremena da se spremam, čitam tekst.
So I read the text and it kind of
Čitam
simmers
tekst.
in my mind, it cooks in my mind, or whatever
I
you want to
pustim
call it.
jednostavno da se kuva propoved u mojoj glavi.
I speak English, obviously.
To što govorim engleski.
So one of the resources I use is the Blue Letter Bible.
I jedan od resursa koji koristim je Blue Letter Bible. To je
.org, I
sajt.
think. Yeah. So it has many commentaries there.
Ima tamo puno komentara.
And I enjoy seeing what other people like have seen that I haven't seen.
I prosto pokušam da vidim šta tu drugi su video što ja nisam video.
I also like to read about the history of that time.
Ja pokušavam da pročitam o istoriji tog vremena.
Because I believe that the Bible wasn't written in heaven.
Ja verujem da Biblija nije napisana u nebu,
but that it's already contextualized that time and that period.
Nego je bilo prosto za to vrijeme, u tom momentu je bilo kontekstualizirano za tu situaciju.
So maybe for me as a Serbian who lives in 2024,
tako da za mene kao neko ko je u Srbiji u 21. veku,
some things might mean different.
Nešto može da ima drugo značenje.
But God knows exactly what he wanted to say, right?
Ali Bog tačno zna šta je tada želeo da kaže.
So I think it's important to also look at the context and maybe a little bit of history.
I bitno je pogledati kontekst i malo istorije.
Tako da, imamo 10 minuta za pitanje.
Da. Ja samo možda, pošto bilo postavljeno pitanje, ću ja da dodam. Mislim da propovednik ne priprema propoved samo kad propoveda.
I believe that a preacher does not only do sermon prep when he's about to teach it.
Ako samo tada se priprema, onda je to bez veze.
Then that's no good.
Znači ono što je priprema jeste da ti čitaš stalno.
Something that sermon prep for me is the continual reading of the Bible.
Znači ako hoćeš budeš dobar propovednik Biblije, ti moraš znati istoriju Biblije.
So if you want to be a good preacher of the Bible, you have to know the history of the Bible.
I ne možeš znati o Asirskom carstvu samo kada spremaš o tu temu, nego moraš da znaš kontekst i uvek kad čitaš Bibliju, postoje Asirsko carstvo, uticalo je ovako i neke takve stvari.
So you can't be thinking about Assyrian kingdom only when you're reading about the Assyrian kingdom in the very verse in the Bible, but you kind of have to know the overall picture of the history of that kingdom.
Znači to je uvek tu, u tvom umu negde.
That's always in your mind.
Tako da mislim da je veliki deo propovedanja to što ti radiš godinama.
So I believe that a big part of sermon prep is something that you're doing over years and years.
I kad uzmeš tekst, ti ne možeš da razmišljaš, koje je sad u Nemino doba bilo carstvo.
So when you're reading a text, you can't be like, oh man, I wonder what kingdom ruled here and what were the world powers in this time.
Kao kod Nemije.
Like Nehemiah.
Znači, kako ti se razvijaš kao propovednik, ti znaš šta je taj deo Biblije.
And as you develop as a preacher, you know what that part of the Bible looks like historically.
I ja razumem kad je neko na početku, on to ne zna.
And I understand if you're new at sermon prep, you don't know these things.
Ali ako želiš da budeš propovednik, onda moraš to da razviješ.
But if you would like to be a preacher, then this is something that you need to develop.
I to često vidim kod propovednika, apsolutno ne znaju ništa o istoriji.
This is something that I notice about preachers is sometimes they have no idea, no clue about the history.
I onda se nalupaju u tome što pričaju.
And then they talk funny things, I mean.
Zato što ne znaju istorijski kontekst cele priče Biblije.
Because they don't know the historical context of that part of the Bible.
Tako da mislim da je jako bitno da ti čitaš stalno.
So I think it's very important that you read the Bible all the time.
Znači ne otvoriš istoriju Starog Zaveta kada pripremaš nešto iz Starog Zaveta, nego pročitaš celu istoriju Starog Zaveta.
You don't open the history of the Old Testament only when you're about to teach a certain passage, but you kind of learn about it over the years and you study it aside from it.
Da, i ne moraš biti profesor Starog Zaveta.
You don't have to be an Old Testament professor.
Ali nešto moraš znati o toj knjizi koju propovedaš.
But you need to know stuff, a historical context of that book that you're preaching.
I onda, mislim da to je veliki deo pripreme propovednika.
So I believe that is a big part of sermon
Svo ono
prep.
znanje koje si prikupio u toku vremena.
All the knowledge that you have over time, built over time.
Da, isto tako ja imam veliku zbirku citata, misli koje čuvam u kompjuteru, stotine i stotine stvari koje sam zapisao sebi.
Also, I have like hundreds and hundreds of things that I wrote down in my computer, just some thoughts that I have had over the years.
Sve propovedi imam zabeležene koje sam propovedao.
All my sermons, I have them documented on my computer.
I sve to izvor koji koristiš iznova, koji povezuješ, istražuješ.
It's a source that you keep using. It's a source that you keep going back to and then exploring some more, adding to it. And
tako da neka moja ideja ovoga što sam hteo da kažem, nadam se da me razumete, jeste da ako želiš da propovedaš, onda ne pripremaš propoved samo kad propovedaš.
So my point is, if you want to be preaching God's word, you don't do sermon prep only when you're about to preach a sermon.
Nego je to nešto u čemu si stalno.
It's something that you're just immersed in all the time.
Stalno. Znači, pojavi se nova knjiga o istoriji Starog Zaveta ili Novog Zaveta ili nešto, ti ćeš uzeti to da pročitaš, da vidiš šta tu novo saznaješ.
If there's a book about Old Testament, like context, history, that comes out, or New Testament, you should pick up that book and read about it and educate yourself.
Iako možda ne propovedaš sad Novi Zavet.
Even though you might not be preaching the New Testament right now. So that's all. Ja mislim da imamo vremena za otprilike jedno pitanje, tako da ako neko misli da imamo baš najpametnije pitanje...
Nisu trebali da stave propovednik.
So we have a time for only one question, so if you think you have the best question, you're the guy. So really good question. What do you do when you're a beginner and you're nervous? There's a word for it, like stage fright. Stage fright, yes.
I sad, propovedniku dali mikrofon. Prva stvar, prihvati da je to super.
First of all, I would say that's great.
I meni to stvarno pomoglo.
That helped me.
Znači, kad sam shvatio da to nije sad neka moja mana, nego da jednostavno prihvatim, meni je stalo do onog što radim.
And when I understood, it's not like a bad thing about me, but it's because I care so much about what I do.
Znači, to mi je već skinuo teret.
That like lifted off that burden off my shoulders.
Nisi ti neki tamo ne znam nija šta, nego tebi je stalo do tog što radiš.
You really care about what you're doing.
Razumeš, da skini ti te osjećaj da se osjećaš loše u vezi sebe što imaš tremu.
So I would say take off that burden off of you of feeling bad about having stage fright.
Tako da meni je to bilo jako korisno.
So I think that's a very important thing for me.
Druga stvar, prestao sam da pitam ljude šta misle o moje propovedi.
Second thing, I stopped asking people about what they think about my sermon.
Znači, niko živo ne pitam.
I don't ask anybody.
Zato što jednostavno, jednostavno ne treba ti to. To ti ne doprinosi da budeš bolje.
It just doesn't help you be better.
Da, neće ti skloniti tremu.
It's not gonna get rid of your stage fright.
Samo će možda dodati malo još više treme. Da ćeš uvijek pokušavati šta ljudi kažu.
It might even add to it because you're always gonna be thinking, what are people thinking?
Tako da ja bih rekao da je to drugo. I treća stvar koju sam ja radio, ja bih probao propoved. Znači, propovedao bi u praznoj sali propoved.
And the third thing I would say about that is that I would I would teach a sermon in front of an empty room.
Čisto da pokušam da vidim kako to zvuči.
Just to see how it sounds to me.
I četvrta stvar,
And
moraš
thing number
naći
4,
tvoj način.
you have to find your own way.
Znači, kad ti pronađeš ono što je tebi, kad ne pokušaš više da imitiraš nekog drugog kako propoveda, nego nađeš sebe, to je to.
When you find yourself and you're not trying to imitate somebody else, when you find your like flow and who you are, I think you're on the right track.
Na primjer, ovdje Gale propoveda i kad je krenuo da propoveda, koristio je beleške.
Gale is teaching here, and when he started teaching here, he used his notes.
Je bio užas.
And it was horrible.
Ja sam rekao, brate, molim te, nemoj koristiti beleške.
I told him, please don't use notes.
I ovako, top.
And it was just like that.
Za njega je beleška bila smrt.
For him, notes were death
Zato što je
for him.
spontan.
Because he's spontaneous.
I ovo ga je vezalo u čvor.
But notes kind of kept him twisted in a knot.
Tako da mislim da je to isto jako ti pomogne.
I think that's a very important thing, yeah. So.
Couple of thoughts. One, when the audience knows that you're not a skilled speaker or a veteran speaker,
Kada ljudi koji te slušaju znaju da ti nisi neki veteranski propovednik i iskusni orator,
and you look like one of us up there, like nine out of 10 of us would never do what you're doing up there because we also would have stage fright.
I kada te mi gledamo tako i osjećamo se kao da smo mi ti, jer 9 od 10 od nas koji slušamo tvoju propoved razmišljamo, ja nikad ne bi ovo mogu raditi.
The people you're speaking to, they're on your side.
Ljudi kojima propovedaš, oni su na tvojoj strani.
They're not thinking less of you, they're thinking, man, you're brave to be up there.
Ne misle ništa manje o tebi, nego razmišljaju, wow, ovaj lik je hrabar što je ispred nas.
The other thing I think that helps is have the beginning of your sermon. Do something at the beginning that you feel the most comfortable with.
Jednu stvar koju bih predložio je da na početku svoje propovedi uradiš nešto sa čim si onako komforan.
I find that if I get a good start and I've tried something easy, maybe the introduction is going to be a story from my life that I know really well, and I can speak it without any difficulty, that helps me just get going, as opposed to starting with something that's complicated and makes me start off with a stumble, and then it's like stumbling the whole way on.
Nešto što bi dodao znači je da uradiš to. Za mene jedna udobna stvar, onako koju radim, jeste da bi ispričao neku priču iz svog života na početku propovedi. Ne bi započeo sa dubokom teologijom ili nekim teškim tekstom, nego bih uradio nešto što je meni prijalo, a to je pričanje neke priče iz mog života.
There's two ideas.
To su dve ideje. I would have one more idea, I guess. Pero, možeš ti?
Još jednu idejemo.
I think that, when you're standing behind the pulpit,
To da stojiš iza propovedonice.
Nick or Mike, somebody said it, it's like, God has placed you to be there.
Bog te stavio da budeš tamo.
And if you don't want to be there, you have to go and tell him that, he placed you there for a reason.
Znači, Bog te stavio tamo sa ciljem i jednostavno s njim treba to da razrešiš.
And that very Sunday, you're supposed to be talking to these people who are in front of you.
I trebaš da govoriš tim ljudima koji su pred tobom, te nedeje.
And I struggle with that because I always know there's better preachers than me.
I ja sam se bojao, ja sam uvijek znao, to jest mučio s tim zato što sam znao da ima boljih od mene.
But God thinks that 2 Sundays from now in Kragujevac, I'm supposed to teach my church.
Ali Bog prosto zna da ja za 2 nedelje treba da poučavam crkvu.
From Galatians.
Iz Galatima.
And, so that takes away that just like insecurity from me.
I to prosto nekako oduzima tu nesigurnost od mene.
Tako da je to. Pizza je servirana iza vas. The pizza's behind you. How much time do you think, Nick, we should do this?
Koliko imamo vremena?